welcome GEOFF COX. He's a professor of art and computational culture at the London South Bank University. He's the co-director of the Center for the Study of the Networked Image. He's the co-director of the Master's Curating Art and Public Programs and Adjunct at Aarhus University. Well, that's a lot of direction, so we come directly to your presentation as soon as it's on the screen. I'm very excited.
A lot of co-direction.
A lot of co-direction. Yeah. There's direction and co-direction. You can't direct without, co-direct without, whatever.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. And I hope what I've got to say has some relevance following all the previous presentations. I feel like I need to make some qualifications to begin with by saying, this section is about curation. I'm not really going to talk about curation. I suppose I'm seeing this in a broader context of education programs and public programs, as you mentioned, and I'm going to talk about a set of ideas about the coming together of visual literacy and computer vision in terms of the way we can explore that coming together with groups of people who teach art and design education in particular. So I've been doing a very modest project with a group of secondary school teachers in collaboration with the Institute of Education, University of London, the Photographers Gallery, and with funding from the Turing Institute. And then this project, it comes from an ongoing collaborative project that takes its point of departure in John Berger's TV series from 1972 called Ways of Seeing, a documentary for the BBC, the scripts of which were made into a book of the same name, also published in 1972. And Ways of Seeing emphasized how particular elite forms of knowledge were legitimated to support class, gender, and racial privilege. And then, of course, the broader interest, in terms of computer vision, is to ask to what extent these issues map onto the discussions around critical AI, bias, and social justice. Berger explains how seeing reinforces an ocular-centric paradigm of knowledge and power founded in Western modernity and colonialism, based on the relative positions of who and what is looking and who and what is being looked at. That every image embodies a particular way of seeing, as he puts it, demonstrates how, even without words, images support an elite worldview, and hence the necessity of something like visual literacy to draw attention to the underlying ideologies. The critical analysis of visual culture, to which Berger's essay continues to be a key reference. This is still kind of like on the curriculum of most art and design degrees in the UK at least, but I'm not sure how that resonates in a German context. Sort of demonstrates how visual literacy, continues to be needed and developed, and the way that worldviews are consolidated. This example is a really good one. It appears in Ways of Seeing itself. So again, quoting Berger, but I suppose I would add, to what extent has this relation become further unsettled, and therefore any project of literacy more difficult to apply, as images no longer simply represent things in the world, but are an active part of invisible visual culture, and as such exhibit new forms of distributed power. I was thinking of the term algorithmic governmentality in relation to this, from the work of Antoinette Rouvray. So some questions arise. How are dominant worldviews reinforced differently, and what kind of literacy applies, if at all? To what extent are the relations between words and images transformed by large pre-trained vision language models that we've seen today? And what are the implications for the theoretical frameworks that we apply? Again, this came up earlier. First, I need to clarify what's at stake in an analysis of visual culture through literacy and subsequently in computational literacy, moving more onto an expanded notion of visual literacy that is problematized by developments in computer vision. For Berger, it was the ambiguity of the image that generated its power of signification, understood at the time of writing, of course, in the early 1970s, by the influence of semiotics and structuralism, and of course underpinned by Marxism. Moreover, the notion of visual literacy is a paradoxical notion, as if seeing can be simply equated with reading, reinforced as it has been by the linguistic metaphor at the heart of critical theory. If both signs and images have taken on an even more prominent role in contemporary culture, the effect of the coming together of semiotics and capitalism, what Franco Berardi describes as semio-capitalism, and in which, of course, there are ever more points of view, visual metaphors, and so on, might we regard these as ever proliferating examples of visual hegemony, in which the complex operations of algorithmic and data processes are even more hidden and, of course, effective. More to the point, the relation between what is visible and the names or annotations that we give to what we see, or indeed what is visualized from a text input, seem to persist as a problem of literacy, rooted in the tendency to conflate representations with the things they represent. Whereas, of course, from semiotics, we at least know that this relation is arbitrary. So to what extent does media literacy remain up to the task of analyzing contemporary visual culture and to understand the ways in which signs have been incorporated into the operations of capitalism? In addition, what are the misrecognitions afforded by theoretical concepts that seem to assume images to be human-centered, or indeed like human language, or even like speech acts? Moreover, images exhibit the ability to act in the world and upon us, famously articulated by Harun Farocki's notion of operational images. They no longer simply represent things in the world, but are an active part of an operation, as he puts it, externalizing new forms of distributed power that derive from the eye machine. In the case of computer vision systems, they shape the world, of course, in their own terms. But again, to what extent is this a question of literacy? Indeed, does literacy remain a useful descriptor for reading computational images, especially given its enthusiastic uptake in education policy and the creative industries? And of course, its adaptation to other technical forms and cultural values. I'm thinking here of not only digital literacy, but examples like carbon literacy, for instance. Almost everything seems to be characterized as a literacy. So I should explain a little bit more what I mean by literacy, I suppose. Literacy indicates not only the cultural ability to read and write, but more broadly demonstrates competence or knowledge of practices that allow users to maintain and build social imaginaries. And it should be remembered that the skill to read and write were once specialist skills and not something that extended to the whole of society. The politics of literacy was further developed, at least in the UK, in the interdisciplinary field of cultural studies, setting out to understand how meanings are produced within wider systems of power and control, even in the most everyday of circumstances. And of course, in the recognition of global expansion and the significance of culture to all aspects of everyday life. The politics of media literacy is that users can produce meanings through collective action or counter-hegemony. rather than simply receiving messages as intended, as if an interrupted flow of information. In other words, literacy is socially constituted and takes material forms, and this is the case in visual culture and popular media, as well as computational information, based as it is on material infrastructures and language. Literacy is a combination of individual skills, a material system, and a social practice, useful in terms of its wider application, which is enabled by its particular infrastructure and constantly changing and being transformed by the development of inscription technologies. And if we broadly agree that there's a moral imperative to encourage everyone to learn to read and write, then an expanded literacy, the ability to read, write, and program, helps to understand what words mean and do. The arguments for coding literacy seem compelling, but also raise concern about the motivations behind the kinds of literacy that are being introduced and by whom, and to what extent this deviates from the earlier description of counter-hegemony. Various examples come to mind that teach children how to code, or more to the point, the principles of computational thinking. In this case, to be literate is to think and see the world mathematically or algorithmically like a machine. V's book challenges the assumption that literacies are necessarily assumed to be for the social good. More to the point, what literacy is and what kinds of skills are required to become literate have tended to be kept really vague, to be easily shaped for vested interests. And the development of literacy can be seen to follow what Stefano Harney and Fred Moten have described as the proliferation of capitalist logistics through the management of pedagogy. Literacy, in this sense, is carefully controlled to manage who acquires what skills, but also retains the potential to force coding out of its specialization in certain disciplines. This should clearly not be the preserve of computer science, nor an elite group of specialist programmers or black boxed by the proprietary interests of big tech. This is especially important when considering what new kinds of literacy are required to engage with contemporary vision language practices. More to the point, new ways of seeing require new forms of literacy to account for the invisible realm of algorithms and database infrastructures. I was going to skip this slide, but it's my own attempt in collaboration with the artist researcher Winnie Soon to try to make a kind of how-to book for critical technical practice. And I thought it was relevant still because there's 10 chapters. It goes through these various sort of technical concepts. And then there's an additional chapter which uses a recurrent neural network and reprocesses all the previous chapters. So it's quite playful in setting up a kind of program of pedagogy and then completely undermining it at the same time. I'd like to think, anyway. When computer vision systems see, they exercise power to shape the world in their own image, which in turn is built upon the problem of generalization. The relation between seeing and knowing is likely to be set at the very lowest common denominator. Reading source code to understand how a machine sees is not particularly revealing in this respect, despite what I argued earlier, but rather requires a more relational literacy. To reiterate the point, it is not simply a case of how humans see the world or how they use machines to see, but how machines see and produce the world in their own terms. Machine or algorithmic literacy is required to understand the implications of this more fully, how our worldviews are being reproduced, and how seeing is enmeshed with the machinic unconscious, again, something that's come up previously. For not only what is seen, but but for what remains unseen and yet still operative. The relation between what we see and what we know remains at the center of this, echoing Berger's words at the beginning of this talk. But how do we learn to see? And more to the point, how do machines learn to see? Clearly they are not one and the same, and yet it's common to draw analogies between machine intelligence and cognitive development in humans, especially in children, following a constructivist idea of learning as something informed by experience. Yet this appears superficial when applied to teaching a machine to see, as for instance, in the following example cited by artist-researcher Nicolas Meleve of Fei-Fei Li describing her insight into the development of ImageNet. The example presents a reductive equivalence between human and machine vision, yet Meleve's concern is more about what is implied about training and learning in general. He points out that we are all involved in the process of teaching machines to look at images in everyday situations, and describes the enormous amounts of training that takes place when we use everyday devices such as smartphones and computers. Meleve's interest is not so much our complicity in these processes, but to investigate which pedagogical methods might be useful. What can we learn about learning from the dynamics of machine learning? The intervention is to ask to what extent machine learning and radical pedagogy might learn from each other. A double movement between teaching and learning can be detected between humans and machines that requires a new form of visual learning beyond mere equivalences, and with profound political consequences based on what seems to be a lack of reciprocity. Sorry, I can't say that word. As previously described, the dataset can be understood to be the algorithm's worldview, which raises the question of what this worldview is, how it was formed, and more importantly, how it can be transformed. How might other ways of training elicit other ways of seeing, and in ways that are socially transformative? I mean, that's the kind of basis of this project, as I explained. I mean, we're kind of in the middle of it. We've been running some workshops with secondary school teachers and with trainee teachers with the idea of trying to cascade some of these principles into the classroom. And we've got a public event coming up at the beginning of December, and the webpage is an advert for that. And in this work, we're curious, as I've said, about how machine learning might contribute to the transformation not only of learning, but of literacy. How is visual literacy challenged by machine vision, and what can they learn from each other? Do we need to unlearn how to see like humans and learn more to see like machines, or rather to see like both in ways that departs from a Western-centric humanist standpoint? The point, if drawing from the post-humanities, is that more diversity might elicit a more sympathetic vision of the world, one that is less based on man, less extractive, and more environmentally aware, especially, of course, given how resource-heavy machine learning actually is, as well as more attentive to other species and how non-human ways of seeing expose alternative epistemologies. A reference for this would be Adrian Mackenzie and Anna Munster's work, where they refer to an operationalization of visuality in which images operate within a field of distributed invisuality, in which relations between images count for more than their indexicality or iconicity, or aura, of course, of a single image. Seeing, or what they call platform seeing, becomes distributed through data practices and machinic assemblages. And this is, of course, what we're referring to when we talk about ways of machine seeing, an assemblage of various parts. Again, this is something that's been reiterated previously. So the question might be, so what kind of literacy is required for such an assemblage that extends literacy beyond representational modes and human sense-making and is attentive to the relational operations of algorithms, datasets, and infrastructures? It's clear, I mean, when I talk about literacy here, of course, it's not as simple as learning a different vocabulary, but of developing a literacy that is co-constituted, one that is more sensitized to relational operations, and that shifts our attention away from the acquisition of technical know-how to new possibilities of critical technical and social practice. In other words, that helps to expose the politics of invisuality and the envisioning of other potentials, to understand how forms of privilege are reproduced and naturalized through new ways of seeing. That's pretty much paraphrasing Berger, of course, so we're back to the beginning. And I will leave it there, and I just hope I've demonstrated what I see to be the importance of the work we're doing in schools, because this is, of course, such a political space.
Thank you, Geoff. Yeah, that's on more differentiated, specific picture of visual literacy and the work you're doing on that. Thank you very much. Are there any questions on Geoff's talk? You're all visually literalized already. Yeah. Oh, you can...
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting talk, and the concept of literacy, as you described it, is really intriguing. Maybe could I ask you to maybe expand a bit more on the workshops that you conducted that were also referenced on the slide with the website, and what are the aspects that you now want to take from the workshops to the event that you announced in December?
Yeah, okay, I'll try to do that briefly. I mean, we've held 2 workshops so far, the first of which was with a group of teachers. In that workshop, we tried to initially talk about some of the principles from ways of seeing, remind them of those principles, then introduce them to an overview of computer vision, but particularly looking at supervised model, I guess, looking at annotation practices, and then running some exercises which were pretty much based on the work of Nicolas Meleve, his PhD, where he looked particularly at the development of ImageNet, as I've referred to. And he does this exercise, which is based on early psychology experiments, where you flash images up and people just say what comes into their head, what they think they see. But the seeing is performed at such a short time frame, in a glance, as he puts it. And then we talk about the kind of material practice of annotation within certain forms of machine vision. And then we use that as a way of thinking through some of the popular models which are available online, like Crayon and DALI, maybe the kind of easy version, the DALI Mini, which actually became Crayon, didn't it? And we then see that as a kind of way of reverse engineering the same practices around annotation. And then encourage teachers to think about image-text relations and the way that they teach these in school and the way those image-text relations might need to be adjusted or in some way. And we did something very similar with the trainee teachers, but in this case we also asked them to speculate on some lesson plans. That didn't go so well, actually. But, I mean, this is work we'll continue, and the next step is to make some of these ideas public and try and get a group of interested people together, and then go into schools and work with young people.
All right, anyone else? Any more questions, further questions?
Thanks so much. That was a fantastic capstone, I think, for the whole conference. So many thanks for this fantastic talk. I wanted to ask you about a term that you used, which is critical technical practice, which obviously comes from Berger, and it has a whole theory building almost, a whole framework behind it. And I just briefly wanted to ask you about the relation that you see between this kind of, let's say, an expert's reflective approach to design and implementation of actual systems versus literacy in school children. Is there a middle ground? Is it related at all? What is the connection here?
I don't know quite how to answer that, actually, but I mean, Agre, of course, I'm surprised hasn't come up before in the event, but it's a key reference, of course, and it's interesting, at least in the most well-publicized essay, that he is referring to AI, and it's a very historical position, of course, but one that's still remains extremely important, I think, in terms of developing interdisciplinary scholarship. And I mean, we refer to this in the handbook I showed called Aesthetic Programming quite centrally, but I'm not quite sure what else I would add, really. I mean, only in terms of saying that the larger project around ways of machine seeing has a broader set of ambitions, and this work in schools is just one kind of strand, where critical technical practice probably doesn't have much purchase, actually.
All right, any further questions for Geoff? Yeah, it was a lot today.